Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job, and we help you level up so you become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo,
And I'm Jared Potter.
and today, Jared, we're continuing what we started in our previous episode. We were talking about accessibility, building accessible web apps, and just a recap, remembering why we're doing this, right? Because not all of our users have the same capabilities, the same, like, for example, not everybody sees the same way, right? Not everybody has the same vision. Some people use glasses, some people have issues with contrast, some people have motor skills issues, right? So we always have to make sure that we cater for all of our users and that all of them can have the same quality of experience, right? This involves auditory problems, a screen reader support, semantic HTML, a lot of things that we can do and baking in our development process. Something very important that we said in the previous episode, Jared, is that you can add this as part of your software process, as part of the sprint, like built in everything you build. Because if you add it to a backlog and then you put it there, it's never going to get done, or it's eventually because there's no direct business value, like to the stockholders, right? The ones that direct what gets done or not. So it's just better to do it inside of the process, like just like you do automation, unit testing, stuff like that. Just add it to the process and you'll get it for free because there's a lot of out of the box stuff that you can do and it will give you all these big wins for your product. So the first thing, right, to remember here, like let's talk a little bit about, let's start with semantic HTML, a little bit about that and the screen readers, Jared. So we covered that, but like something that we didn't cover is that there is this thing called area, and it's an acronym. It stands for something. You can Google it. You know, you have homework with us here, our audience. But area tags, the idea, like the best practice there is not, don't use them by default. Like don't put area tags on everything. Don't use area tags on like for testing purposes to grab elements in your testing framework. Don't you do that? Just use area tags when semantic HTML, semantic elements don't offer what you're looking for. Remember, all the elements in HTML, they have some semantic properties. And some of those are like the role or type, usually. Like, for example, in forms, we have the type, we have a name, we have a value and a state. Those are optional attributes. So try to default to what the element offers out of the box, title, right? Like other things like that, labels for the forms. And if you don't have that, then you can try to use roles for the screen readers, right? Like role button, it's very useful. Role menu, I think. But if not, then use area attributes. So this is just to kick it off there, but to not spend more time really on semantic HTML there, Jared. So yeah, let's continue. Let's continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to add a little bit of context to what we're kind of talking about here, again, because of a lot of our users have different levels of accessibility, a lot of them end up going to keyboard accessibility for interacting with their web apps. And for that reason, that's why we're talking about screen readers. So when a user is going through the website and, generally speaking, tabbing through the different elements, a really great point that you made last point, Juan, was that, being able to order our elements and leveraging semantic elements as much as possible and putting them in a logical order so that when we're tabbing through them, it's going to make sense. And then, yeah, like just like what you're saying here, Juan, that's kind of that order of precedence. You're going to start with trying to use semantic HTML, right, which is HTML that has meaning attached to it. And then as necessary, adding a role attribute if you need it. And then lastly, adding an ARIA tag attribute, not a tag, excuse me, kind of
Yeah.
in that order. So that, as again, these users are going through our web app, we're maximizing, their experience in that process. But yeah, no, there's a couple small bits with semantic HTML that I think are worthwhile mentioning that we may have missed last time. So one of those being are the H tags, right? So everybody has seen these H1, H2, H3, all the way up to H6. And most people just kind of think about these as being different sizes, right? So I'm gonna, if I wanted to be a big title, I'll use H1. If I want it to be a smaller one, I'll use a different one. But there's actual specific semantic meaning to these, where generally speaking, the way that these things were designed was that an H1 is meant to represent, a primary title for like an article or for a page, and that H2s or H3s would come after those the H1s, right? The higher number or the lower numbers rather, in precedence order. So when we're using these H elements, we should try to make sure that we're using them in the way that they were intended to maximize the experience for our users. But Juan, what's your experience with that, or any other semantic elements that perhaps
Yeah.
we forgot to
So
mention last time?
yeah, so something very important with that, with the H tags, the headings, right? We don't want to skip any tag. So sometimes, let's say you have a design from the UX designer, and you have the H1 size matches that for the styles you have, but then you find that the next one is like an H4. So sometimes we just skip it, right? That's really bad for accessibility. You don't want to do that because screen readers, they use the tags as a structural outline of the document, and they use that for navigation. And there's other things you can use along the head tags, the H tags, which is the section tags, like for example, main or aside or nav, right? And the idea is that you have just one of those, so don't use a lot of like main, because then it's going to be very confusing for a screen reader. But it's very important, do not skip. So what's the best practice there, Jared? If you have a design and the H1 matches, but then the next one, the next heading you have in your page is maybe an H4. In that case, no, you use an H2, right? Because maybe that doesn't match the design, but then with CSS, you style it to match the design. So that semantically is going to be correct, and it's going to help with accessibility. And as we say before, this is built in the process. You didn't have to, you get it for free, right? So it's very important. Do not skip those tags and use other semantic elements, navs for the navigation, and main for the main section, asides for other sections that you may have in the page, right? Like maybe a navigation on the right, or something that is not like the main content of the page. But that's very important for the navigation. And yeah, that's like the main thing. Like the other thing is links, right? Use links properly. You can use links also to provide a structure to the document for navigation, like anchor tags that have anchors on the same page, right? So you click it and you're not navigating away, you're just navigating to a section within the same page. That also helps a lot with accessibility. So there's a lot of things you can read about that. There's best practices, for example, for links that you want to hide on your page from a screen reader. Sometimes, like something very important, let's say you have a sign up and you don't want that sign up to be read every time the screen reader has to navigate. That's very annoying for our users that use screen readers. So there's strategies that you can hide that element from the screen reader. It's still on the page, but then they don't have to navigate every time through it, every time they want to navigate the page and start over. So keep those things in mind. And that's all I can think of about semantic HTML that we didn't mention last time.
Yeah, no, I think that's some great points right there. Here's an interesting question I have, Juan, actually, I thought we could talk about a little bit is our modals, right? So when we're talking about modals, right, which, and by the way, modal or pop-up for anyone out there is just anytime you're on a screen and, a smaller screen, quote unquote, or window will pop up in front. How can we, what are some things as engineers we can do to help focus attention there properly for our users that need that extra bit of help?
If you're referring to like the visual aspect, maybe it's important to have some and HTML offers out of the box this. There's a model that you can use, and they offer like this background. I don't remember the name. There's a term for that background that is kind of like grayed out or dark, right? That covers everything. That helps with contrast and focus, so you focus on the content. You can use attributes to autofocus if there's an input or something that the user should see there. Is that kind of like what you're asking there, or I took it a different
Yeah, no,
direction?
absolutely. Absolutely. Making sure that if something pops up on the screen, that focus changes to it properly so that, again, someone using a screen reader properly is where it needs to be, rather than like maybe tabbing through the items in the background still, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's very important, because that's how they know, like, right? Especially like it's very important when you render new forms, you should autofocus to the main input if you need to type anything. Let's say you're gonna, so then that avoids an extra click or an extra tap on the keyboard. So that's very important. And how do you do that? There's like, for example, for input elements, there's an autofocus attribute you can add. So you get that out of the box for free. You don't have to do crazy JavaScript or anything. So that's very, very, like, you get it for free, right? So that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. What's another topic we need to go over, Juan, here?
Yeah, so we didn't cover, I think, last time about there's media, right? Right now, our web applications, not all of them, but many web applications have some sort of video or audio or rich media, right? For example, it depends on the platform, but at least I can think of every company out there, they have at least one marketing video, right? One cover video that says, like, this is what we sell, right? Sometimes applications are rich applications. Maybe let's say you have a video platform you're building. Then that's a lot of media, right? So there's accessible tags that you can keep in mind to embed subtitles and to make your media accessible. So let's talk about that, Jared. Like what you have to tell us about, like, all the rich media accessibility wins that we can get out of the box with everything the browser provides natively.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I don't know for how many years it's been here now, but there's been, full browser support for being able to play, rich audio files and rich video files. Most popular for video is going to be an MP4, especially an MP4 that's been optimized for the web. Is generally speaking, ideally what you want to be using on your website. Anyway, there's native elements. There's an audio element and there's a video element, and then numerous options and attributes and child elements that you can use to really kind of customize the player for the audio or for the video. And a great thing that they also had baked right into all modern browsers is the ability to create a really simple subtitles or caption compatibility support. So you can actually create, if you Google web VTT, it's a specific text file type that lets you specify a timestamp and then some text that goes along with it. So if you and your company created a video, marketing video, 60 seconds long, you could have someone go in there and just manually kind of create this file, put the text that's necessary in there. And mind you, you can also create this for multiple different languages. So, users can switch between them if they would like. And then automatically the browser is going to know, like, okay, if we're playing the video and we're at this point, we're going to show this text. And then as soon as this other bit of, this next timestamp comes along, we're going to play that one. So yeah, it's really great what these browsers have provided for us. And all we have to do is just put a little bit of work in to make sure that we are, being accessible to everybody.
Yeah, yeah, and that's like one of these things that, like, people don't know about, right? And they just don't do it. But it's important to include, like, I think subtitles, they're very important, at least on your marketing videos. Maybe not all the user uploaded content, but that will really help because you don't know if everybody can hear, right? So you are opening to all the market, to that
Yeah.
potential 20% or 30% or 10%, depending where you're at, that could become potential customers, could be potential customers for you. So Jared, another thing that we haven't mentioned that is very important is about the text sizes. So that's another thing. Usually we get a UX designer and we just, like, implement their designs, right? But sometimes UX designers are not focused on accessibility. They're just more focused on the experience or in the looks, or they just are experts in the experience for just regular users, but they are not aware of accessibility issues with their designs. So it's very important. Two things that I'm thinking about this. One is always make sure, like, when you're implementing those designs, make sure that the elements do not overlap. Have you ever noticed that maybe you have an element and then you try to click it or tap on it, and then is like swallowing the vein or covering another element that you actually want to click. And this happens a lot when you have mobile devices. So it's very important to always test your sites on mobile devices. Always make sure that you are capturing or changing the sizes, use responsive designs, so then your elements do not overlap in smaller screens. And there's media queries that you can use for that. So please read about it and make sure that your site does not overlap elements. That's one thing. And the second thing with the designs is the text size. We take that for granted too. Sometimes the text is too small. Actually, text should be at least 14 points or bigger. If you use 12 points still on your site, you're doing it wrong. If you don't have media queries or you don't have responsive typography in your site, then when you are on a mobile device with a high resolution screen, right? Let's say you have an iPhone with one of those super high resolution screens, the text might look too small. So make sure to keep something called responsive typography, super easy to implement, and it's just playing with relative units. So you can read about responsive typography. That's the key term for you to look up and then learn. And then you can make sure your site is accessible in mobile devices, especially for users that have a hard time reading. Something also important, Jared, is the color choices. So contrast. We talked about this a little bit before. To make sure that you have enough contrast, but also for the not just the color choice, but also there's contrast for the text size. So there's some rules, and I don't have it memorized or anything. So this is something I want to mention. There is an accessibility guideline. It's called Web AIM, the web accessibility in mind, and the website is webaim.org. There's guidelines there. It's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and then you can get all this information about how to use text sizes. For example, they tell you like there's some ratios, like for example they have a 15:9:1, so that just means like maybe the main size text size is 150% bigger than the next size, so they specify everything there. And also with the colors, there's some color information there. So something very important, because it's so much information, and it's a guideline, so that means like if you don't do it quite right, there's no right or wrong. Just follow the guideline as much as you can for certain elements, for certain things, right? It's not like a strict thing here. So you're not going to break anything. You're just going to make more accessible sites. There's an extension, a Chrome extension is called Accessibility Insights. So Google it, accessibilityinsights.io is the website. You can add it to Chrome. There's other platforms that are supported. They have for Chrome, for Android, for Windows, and then you can you can test your site, and it can provide you insights, kind of like the performance insights that we talked about a few episodes before, like a few weeks ago. And it will provide you with advice like, hey, make sure that this and that, make these changes. And it's little changes you can make to tweak your site to make it or your web app to make it more accessible. So yeah, Jared, what else do you have to add to those things I just mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One little bit on the, there's the responsive typography point. So in pretty much all browsers, and especially, I mean, I think most developers probably are developing across some sort of Chromium based browser, Brave or Chrome or even Internet Explorer, or excuse me, Edge, excuse me, not Internet Explorer.
Well, it's still used.
Yeah, I know the icon looks like almost the same. But if you open up your dev tools on your website, right next to one of the hot dog menus there is a little button that looks like a little phone. And if you click on it, it will actually switch your layout to be some default phone. I can't remember which one they stick in there by default, probably Pixel 3 or something like that. But there's actually a drop down, and in that drop down, it lets you select different common cell phone screen sizes. And you can play around and see, hey, what does your website look on this phone versus that phone, or even tablets, right? There's options in there. And of course, you can type in your own custom height and width as well. But that's a really easy, quick way to test to see what your site generally will look like on a mobile phone. Now, as with any type of process like this, it's not always foolproof. Ideally, if you can deploy your site to a real place and actually test on a real, ideally some kind of iPhone and then some kind of Android phone, that's going to be the best experience. Another small tip is there's a really great website out there called caniuse.com, which just essentially catalogs and keeps track of browser features across all sorts of different browsers and devices. And you can also take a look at that and kind of see what are the market shares for different types of browsers, and decide like, who do which browsers do you actually want to support and which ones do you not want to support? A point of accessibility is, let's say someone does load your website from Internet Explorer. Well, chances are if you're using modern technologies, that your website's probably not going to work well. And either one, you can spend a ton of work to make it compatible, or two, you can do a quick detect, a little bit of JavaScript to see what browser are we in, and if we're in Internet Explorer, just say, hey, we don't support this, right? So from the get-go, you're just like letting the user know, hey, this isn't going to work out really well. But yeah, anyway, my point is just play around, make sure your website does look good on a mobile device, and it's just built into the browser that makes it really, really easy to test that out.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts on that for what you were talking about there, Jared. One thing, like, especially for our audience, right? New graduates, don't make this mistake. Sometimes new things come out. So always use can I use, but always make sure that you have the right technology stack. For example, let's say ES 2020, something new is coming up, let's say observables, or it came out. I don't remember if it is part of the spec or not, or at least private properties that came out last year, I think, with the last spec. But doesn't mean you can just use them and your site supports them. So make sure if you are using that, you have in your tech stack or in your build process, you have transpilation to older versions of JavaScript like ES5 or ES6. So then it will make it compatible. If you don't do that, your site is not gonna work. That's one thing. Another thing, they'll get hyped. So for example, let's say when Flexbox came out, everybody wanted to use it. And one of the problems we had with more junior engineers, or that I had, was like, hey, yes, this is new. It's great, but you shouldn't use these properties because this is still pretty new. Or when CSS Grid came out, because like it came out, but not everybody is using the latest version Evergreen browsers, and so you have to make sure that you see what your users are using, right? And then see if there's polyfills or make it compatible. So that's where I'm going with this is like there's adoption. When something new comes out, there's an adoption period. Usually with the web, it takes about 3 to 4 years to be like, yes, now we can support this natively, or there's polyfills or things like that. Always make sure that you have the right tools in place so you can use the latest and greatest. Okay, so that's the first thought. The second, you talked about the feature change, feature detection, and there's some libraries out there. For example, I've used Modernizer, which is a feature detection library for HTML5 and CSS3. And what it does is like, instead of you having to detect user agents and know like, for example, manually like, oh, can I use this or not? What you do, that's something called progressive enhancement. So just I'm just throwing the thing out there. Google it, learn everything you can about progressive enhancement. But that just means like you have this base site, and if the browser supports more features, you enable them. If the browser does not support them, you don't enable them, but everybody has access to the same experience. So Modernizer, what it does, it adds classes based on feature detection. So for example, let's say if my browser supports, just an example, I haven't used this with Modernizer, but just an example, let's say if my browser supports CSS grids, then a class is going to be added by this Modernizer library. It's a JavaScript library that will add some CSS classes to certain markup and elements like on the HTML. And then I can see like, oh yeah, it's there. I can apply things. I can use CSS grid. So you can use that to prefix like your CSS, like CSS grid, the class they add automatically, and then your own CSS. And then it will just work natively or not. So you don't have to do or manage the change detection and provide progressive enhancement, which is a really good practice to keep in mind. I challenge you to turn off JavaScript on your site and let me know if your site or your web app works. I guarantee you that most of the sites that you work on or the web apps, you turn off JavaScript, the site won't work, right? Unless if you're a big company, some big companies are very strict with accessibility and they're like, yep, I still work with JavaScript off. So that's part of accessibility too. But unfortunately for that one, Jared, not everybody has the resources to like make sure the site works without JavaScript and with JavaScript. But that's one thing, we're taking that for granted. Not all devices have JavaScript enabled. There's some security policies. If your JavaScript doesn't work, there should be some sort of fallback. So that also has to do with accessibility. And oh, Jared, and one reminder here that for everybody listening, don't forget to follow us on Twitter or follow us in YouTube or whatever platform you're listening this on. So you support us and we keep creating new content. And we have the links there on the description of this video or this podcast audio. But yeah, I mean that's everything I have to add to what you just mentioned, like the thoughts that came when you were talking about the media responsiveness.
Yeah, no, I think those are really great points to add there. Some of these things, ultimately are getting into a little bit of, you could say, nitty gritty bits, but I mean, honestly, being exposed to them at least makes you aware of them so that, when it comes to perhaps ultimately addressing them, you can go and do that. With all of this stuff that we're teaching you students out there, at the end of the day, definitely focus on building, really solid foundations of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? Juan and I are here trying to, take the step up, take the level up, again, leveling up your skills to help you be a better engineer beyond just having really great foundations, but keep those in mind.
Yeah.
One last, go ahead.
I don't know. I was gonna say, yeah, just like we exposed you. We're not experts on a lot of things, or we know it's about exposure, right? If you know something exists out there, you can go and apply like the guidelines, like or the extension. The extension will tell you what to do. Or when it comes to web performance, like you don't, it's really hard to keep track of everything. But like when we talked about Web Vitals, you use the tool and the tool tells you what to do. So the important thing is that the tool is out there, so then you can use it and you have those resources, these resources available.
Yeah, absolutely. As just to kind of, so I just kind of have one bit of a random tip just to kind of for myself here, which is when we're talking about, again, having a very diverse set of people using our web apps, there's times where people with either, low visual acuity or, no visual acuity sometimes can have a hard time clicking on buttons or clicking on links or just, clicking on the interactable elements of our web apps. And for this reason, it's important that we're making sure that the size of the interactable elements are large enough, and not only large enough, but also spread apart enough from each other that someone's not going to click one over the other, right? So if like you have some important modal pop up and there's like a yes and a no button, but they're like really close together, right? Someone could, accidentally, or, motor disabilities or whatever, could, click on the wrong item. So, making sure that you space things apart properly, making sure that they are large enough. These are also called tap targets or click targets, can just really go a long way. And like we mentioned in the last episode as well, when you're building forms, making sure you're wrapping labels around your elements. The biggest culprit of this is the radio button. For a lot of people, clicking that itty bitty radio button is hard. So, making sure that you have a label that will trigger that radio button click is going to be really useful. But that's my last tip.
Awesome. Awesome. No, that's great information. We're almost out of time. So just to finish up, Jared, I'm going to share a couple of things here. So remember, read about assistive technologies, enable the screen reader on your platform. Like if you're using Windows, they have built-in screen readers, Mac OS. If you don't have one, install one. There's also Chrome extensions that can help you with that. There's Chrome extensions for the visual aspects. The other Chrome extension I mentioned that helps you with the insights, the accessibility insights. Make sure to keep in mind content reordering or reordering content. We talked about that, right? Like don't use, like, for example, floats, because they throw off the screen readers, right? Like the content might look good, but then when you're navigating maybe through your keyboard, it's going to jump around because that's not really how it's positioned in the DOM. So remember, default to DOM ordering. If something needs to go first, move it in the DOM. That's going to be better. Learn about area labels. Don't use them out of the box. Like always, use that as a last resort. Always default to semantic HTML. And something that we cannot not mention, Jared, is the A11Y project. So the A11Y project covers a lot of things. It's very extensive, and it's everything about web accessibility. So I want you to visit it, a11project.com, and there's a checklist there. You click it, and you'll see a lot of things that we talked about here and things that we didn't talk about, but it's a whole checklist that will say things. For example, like I have it open right here, and it says like, hey, do you use a lang attribute on your HTML element? So then you can like check it and see like, oh, if you don't have it, you go and add it. Why? Because the language, that's also part of accessibility. If I open a site in German, I'm not going to understand it, right? So I have an accessibility issue right there. So it's very important to include those things. So go check that checklist, go through the items. You don't have to comply with it 100%, but it's like a guide. It will help you apply a lot of the things, like, do you use a button as a button? Do you use a label for your attribute, for your forms? Does your image have an alt attribute? And even you don't have it, then you add it. Are you using the right heads, right? The head tags. Are you skipping? Are you using lists? Are you using the right controls? So it's like an extensive checklist, and it teaches you everything that really you need to know, and you don't have to memorize it. You can always go, every time you're building something, go check it and make sure that before you release some new code to production, always go through it and be like, oh yeah, I comply with these things that I did, right? Or add it as part of your code review. Maybe like, okay, make sure that you comply with A11Y. You can have it built in your development process, and then it takes, like, in a code review, maybe 10 minutes to review and make sure like, hey, don't forget to add the alt. Hey, don't forget to add this, that, and you will have more accessible applications out there. But yeah, I think that's it for today, Jared. Any final thought?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. So yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today. This was Dev Bootcamp Live, where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job and become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter.
I will see you next week. Thank you.